All right, today we're going to talk about the Mexican Revolution that really gets going around first start complaining about the political scene in 1908, and we'll take it into the 1930s, where most historians argue that the revolutionary movement and the violence starts to break down and finally cease and rebuild a new era of government stability. So we're going to go through these different major eras that historians have identified, largely according to which leaders are in office leading the Mexican government. So first we'll start with what becomes known as the Madero era, but that starts at the end of the Diaz era. So Porfirio Diaz had been in office after revolution, basically in 1876, that had pushed out the previous government, took over the government militarily, and named himself president, and had remained in office through a combination of bribing other political parties and other politicians, running for re-election repeatedly, sometimes relying on voting fraud to win re-election. So he had been re-elected 6 times by the early 1900s, and by about 1908, he was getting very much older and seemed possibly hesitant to run for a seventh re-election in 1910. And he started making hints that Mexico might be ready for full-scale democracy. But eventually he did decide to run for re-election himself. But the idea of Mexico transitioning to more full-scale democracy kind of opened up debate within the country, and so some politicians start to publicly mention that democracy would be better than a virtual dictatorship than they had been living under. So the idea is out and is being discussed amongst at least the Mexican politicians, if not the whole country. One of the politicians who really comes out of nowhere, a fairly unknown politician at the time named Francisco Madero. He was basically a wealthy landowner who had been in politics before, wasn't very well known on the national scene, but who basically argued that if Diaz was going to run for another re-election attempt, at the very least he should bring on a vice presidential nominee that would be younger or a political outsider, basically not just another vice president. That would be part of the Diaz group that's been running the country for decades, so that there would be at least some kind of hope in a kind of generational transfer of power at some point. And Madero also started talking about how Mexico really was ready for full democracy and should be allowed to have an open vote. Diaz and his party largely kind of brushed off Madero and similar criticisms. So Madero chose to run against him for president of the country in 1910. Diaz and the government tried to control that election largely through jailing the opposing party's leaders, including Madero himself at one point. And Diaz declared himself the winner of a fraudulent election in June of 1910. That didn't go over very well with the population. So Madero accused the election results of being illegitimate and called for an armed uprising of general people against the government of what he claimed was an illegitimate government, and wrote up a thing called what he called the Plan de San Luis Potosi, from actually in Texas later in 1910, around November. So he's calling for a popular uprising against the government to remove the fraudulent government from office and figure out a way of building up a democracy to choose its own leaders legitimately. Madero's small-scale revolution failed, but actually encouraged other groups to start revolts virtually at the same time in late 1910, which would gradually cause problems for the government, the central government in Mexico City under Diaz over time. One of the biggest ones is led by Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa. So they lead an uprising in the northern parts of the country, mostly kind of hit and run attacks against government garrisons, forts, looking to kind of steal weapons from the government so that they'll have better weapons to launch future attacks against other government outposts. And their movement kind of grows piece by piece over time as they get access to more and more weapons and ammunition and whatnot as their raids are increasingly successful. A whole other revolt starts in the southern part of the country, led by Emiliano Zapata, who was largely angry at land purchase agreements that he and his group often declared to be kind of fraudulent, where he's basically arguing that wealthy people and corrupt people are using the court systems to basically steal land from poor peasants. So that's where Zapata and his movement comes from. And the northern group, the Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco group, invade one of the major cities along the northern border at Ciudad Juarez. So they attack and actually conquer the city in spring 1911, and that forced President Diaz to resign. And Madero is proclaimed the official president in his place. So the guy who had lost the presidential election supposedly in mid-1910 becomes the president upon Diaz's very sudden and shocking resignation. And Diaz actually fled the country a month later in spring 1911. So Madero is the kind of interim president, the acting president of the country, and he immediately calls for elections to be held, fully democratic elections. And when those elections are held, Madero seems to have won those elections, so he went to Mexico City to formally kind of take over the government and start running the government as a democracy. The problem, though, is that none of the kind of three major groups that were leading revolts at the time really trusted Madero very much. So they were in communication with him in 1911 as the election is going after Diaz had resigned. But even though Madero seems to have won the election, none of those major revolutionary groups kind of trusted him very much. And they send messages back and forth with him, but they continue their activities. Zapata kept leading revolts of peasants in the Southwest especially, and continue their fight basically against lawyers and other court officials that they accused of being corrupt and of just basically allowing people with money to go in and steal land from peasants and then kind of auction it off through a corrupted court system, auction system. So that's what becomes known as a Zapatista movement, is mostly directed at getting land back for peasants, ending those corrupt systems, and basically taking the land back that had been confiscated from peasants and sold off, and kicking the wealthier landowners out of lands that they were being accused of having stolen in the first place, and giving the land back to the peasants who had originally owned it. So President Madero refused to endorse those kinds of actions. So eventually the Zapatista movement grows into a formal revolt against even the central Mexican government. Pascual Orozco basically wanted to push Madero to increase the amount of government reforms to make the government more efficient, more democratic. And it seems like Orozco and Madero have a falling out because Orozco is always pushing for more, and Madero basically says, I've done enough. So there's a disagreement between those two, and Orozco basically shuts down his communication with Madero and proclaims a revolt in the northern areas in order to push the government to become increasingly more legitimate through these reforms. And there's also a third major power that gets involved in all this stuff, which is the U.S. government itself. The United States was very worried that these uprisings would threaten American business interest in Mexico. There's a lot of U.S. investors who have bought land or have started companies or factories or whatever in Mexico to take advantage of Mexican laborers, basically. And the U.S. government is very worried that if the Mexican government cannot control or end these revolts that's going on in its own territory, that would hurt the kind of U.S. business interests that had emerged within Mexico. So the U.S. government is very upset that all this is going on in the first place, and is starting to kind of indicate that it might intervene in these revolutionary attempts in Mexico in order to stop it, to create a more stable and calm and peaceful Mexico that would be more amenable to American investors from the United States. There's also another group that gets going to take on Madero, which is a group led by Diaz's nephew named Felix Diaz. So he starts yet another anti-government uprising against Madero in Mexico City itself. And Madero had to basically send out a Mexican general with an army to attack Mexico City against Felix Diaz, and basically put down this new revolt that's broken out that is a directly revolutionary movement aimed at overthrowing the government completely. And this battle that takes place in the Mexico City area becomes known as the 10 Tragic Days in February 1913. So it's extremely bloody. It's a long, violent 10 days in the city where many people are killed. And the major outcome of this, outside of many people being killed and it being really horrific for the population, is that the general that Madero sent in, named Victoriano Huerta, he and Diaz actually meet and sign a deal between themselves to basically unite their forces to remove President Madero from office, put him in jail, and basically insert General Huerta as the new president of the country. And this image shows the amount of violence that was going on in Mexico City in those 10 days. They basically started lining bodies up and trying to have them identified, so it's pretty bad. But this political deal between the generals pretty much came to fruition, to the point where Huerta took over the government, arrested Madero, and Madero was actually assassinated by the end of the month, by the end of February 1913. So Madero is dead, and the General Huerta is proclaiming himself to be president of the country in February of 13. President General Huerta seems to have believed that he could basically turn back the clock and rebuild the old Diaz type of regime, and basically run Mexico like the old caudillo system of the late 1800s. So that was his hope, basically to argue that the revolution has gotten out of hand, too many people have died, and in order to rebuild stability, they need to kind of bring back the political system that had been so good at keeping stability in the late 1800s under Diaz. The problem is that most Mexicans did not view Huerta in a very good light. They basically see him as someone who has murdered his way into power by murdering President Madero. So they see him as a tyrant, a dictator, someone who basically only gets into power by using the military to put himself in power. And all during this time, the Pancho Villa and Zapatista movements are still going, right? Huerta is really only in control or in power because he was able to basically win the Battle of Mexico City and launch a military coup against the sitting president. So Pancho Villa and his group are still very active in the northern areas, and they even start creating what they call a new economic system that was designed to really end unemployment. And their idea is pretty basic. Go to the big landowners, the big hacienda owners, what in the United States we would generally call it like the big plantation owners, and basically confiscate their lands, give the government to some kind of local, or give the land to some kind of local government that would hire the workers to work on those lands, that would raise cash crops for sale in the international market, and that the money that is generated through the sale of the cash crops would basically support the local government and would also support Pancho Villa's troops and gain loyalty, and so that they can go off and spread this kind of economic revolution to as many areas as they could get to, as they could influence. So we should remember that Pancho Villa's so-called new economic system is very different from the Zapatista movement that's going on further south, because the Zapatistas wanted to just basically give land, redistribute land directly to the landless peasants. They didn't want to give it over to the government or anything like that. So Huerta's still in office, but he has these revolutionary movements basically operating in the far north and the far south of the country. There's also a third politician who rises up at this point, named Carranza, Venustiano Carranza. So he was basically a longtime senator under President Diaz in the former era before the revolution got started. He had worked very closely with Francisco Madero, so he is a kind of experienced politician who basically hates the Huerta government, views it as illegitimate and illegal. It only got into office through a military coup, basically. And he issues, Carranza issues a new plan that he calls the Plan of Guadalupe in March 1913, basically to take over the government himself and to hold new democratic elections so that the people could choose again who their leader should be. The plan itself didn't really have any big economic or ideological demands or any kind of changes to the government that it would propose. It was basically a call to overthrow Huerta and reestablish democracy. Some historians even refer to it as a new Caudillo movement, because we don't really know where Carranza is taking this. But the idea got a lot of support amongst the Mexican population, especially in the north, because most of the population didn't like Huerta and what he had done in the first place, and they're looking to get rid of him. So Carranza and Pancho Villa and a third general named Alvaro Obregón all basically unite forces in order to overthrow Huerta and kick him out of office. So it appears that Pancho Villa and Obregón started launching attacks in the northern areas, and then they quickly moved south and converged on a dual attack on Mexico City to overthrow Huerta. So they get to Mexico City in the spring of 1914, and they start attacking the city, trying to overthrow the military government. At the same time, the United States has been very worried about all this stuff going on, and the United States had been involved with some controversial things regarding Mexico. So I don't want to get into the details too much, but basically at about the same time, U.S. troops land in Veracruz on the coastline to the east of Mexico City. So the United States President sent in U.S. Marines to Veracruz, and now President Huerta, sitting in Mexico City, has a big problem on his hands. He's being attacked, or he thinks, and two major invasions at the same place. One through the Mexican Revolution coming after Mexico City, and the other from U.S. troops that have landed on the coast. So Huerta makes the, we eventually now know, bad decision to basically move the few troops that he still has under his control out of Mexico City and send them to the coastline to threaten the U.S. troops and try to convince them to leave. The problem, though, is that when Huerta moved his forces out of Mexico City to go to the coast, that opened Mexico City to outright invasion from the Pancho Villa and Obregón forces. So that gives them a golden opportunity to attack and conquer Mexico City and kick Huerta out of office, which is exactly what they do in June and July of 1914. And Huerta resigns in July of 14. And ever after, he basically accuses the United States of engineering a coup against him and overthrowing him. Historians are fairly critical of that argument. The U.S. forces seem to more have been a distraction than anything else. But that's what Huerta will continue to argue and believe for basically the rest of his life. Huerta's resignation basically puts Carranza in office as the new president. But remember, Carranza had done this in cooperation with Pancho Villa and the other general, Obregon. And the problem with their kind of agreement, their partnership, is none of the three trusted the other two. They all think that the other two are going to conspire to overthrow their one position or something. So they're all very suspicious of each other. And they're immediately very suspicious of each other once they achieve the goal of overthrowing the military government. So the Zapatista and Pancho Villa movements basically had the most energy, the most support amongst the general population at the time. So Carranza kind of talked with them and tried to get their support to kind of transfer that popular support for those two leaders toward the national government. So Carranza moved politically to support some of their demands. He promised new laws to support workers and redress their anger and their complaints against their employers. Carranza started talking about creating a legal system to provide some kind of economic relief to the poor and the urban workers. But even then, Pancho Villa and Zapata did not trust Carranza, and they will combine to launch a new rebellion against Carranza. So Carranza's big supporter that he has left is General Obregon. And Carranza sends Obregon out to basically attack Pancho Villa's position and try to destroy him, or at least bring him under control in some way or other. And this leads to an absolutely horrific battle at a place called Celaya in April 1915 between the official Mexican army under Obregon and Villa's troops. And Obregon won that battle and pushed Villa basically further and further north up into the hills along the northern border. So it reduced Villa's forces and his influence so much that they basically became a guerrilla movement hiding in the hills, trying to avoid capture. And Pancho Villa was so angry at all this that he blamed the U.S. government for helping to support Carranza in all this. So Villa blamed the U.S. government for basically losing these battles. And while they're hiding in the hills along the northern border, Villa's forces will also attack U.S. border towns and settlements that kills dozens of U.S. people in the United States right on the border. And that pushes the U.S. president to send an entire American army down to the area under a famous general, U.S. general, in order to basically hunt down Pancho Villa and his forces and destroy them. But again, Villa's forces are hiding in the hills, and there's a lot of hills in that area. It's very difficult to find someone who doesn't want to be caught, basically. And Pancho Villa knew the people and the terrain of the area very, very well, so it was virtually impossible to catch him there. But Pancho Villa will continue running these raids against the U.S. border every once in a while. And after a while of not being able to catch him or kill him, the Mexican government basically demanded that the U.S. remove its army from Mexico. The idea of a foreign army invading your country and kind of messing around, hunting down your citizens, is usually pretty offensive to government leaders because it reveals that the foreign country is much more powerful and just kind of pushes you around. So after the Battle of Celaya, Pancho Villa and his forces are kind of isolated in the hills to a large extent. And the general who won the battle, Obregón, basically retires at that point, goes back to his kind of family farm, and says he's basically done with Mexican politics. The Zapatista movement is still going in the South, but they never had the troops or the firepower or the general amount of support in the population to launch a general assault or attack on the central government in Mexico City. So they're still active in the South, but they're more of an annoyance to the Mexican government under Carranza than anything else. So President Carranza, he's still in office going into 1917, and his big deal in 1917 is to call a constitutional convention to basically rewrite the Mexican Constitution. Carranza seems to have hoped that he could basically do this and have the Constitution writers basically write an exact copy of the old Mexican Constitution from 1957. So the convention gave the president of the country, this new constitution gave the president a whole lot of power. So the president gets increased powers over the previous constitution that some historians have argued is approaching the powers of a dictatorship. But the Constitution also did much more radical things. It gave the government power to confiscate and redistribute land. So several Mexican presidents and government leaders will get involved in that over the next few decades, largely to guarantee that the population likes them, because usually when they redistribute land, it is kind of unused land that the government owns, and they'll break it up into small parcels and give it out to poor peasants in order to get those poor peasants to vote for them or support them in some way or the other. There's also a part of the Constitution that gave fairly radical labor rights, unionization rights, that went far beyond anything that was happening in the United States or Canada at the same time. So Mexico is giving far greater rights to its general workforce than any of the other North American governments. And the new Constitution also heavily restricted the church's power in Mexican society and the economy. So that was a big, giant change down all the way from the colonial era. The Catholic Church had quite a lot of influence in Mexican society. So these were the biggest changes in the Constitution that largely affected government power and property deals and real estate and things like that. And really for the next several generations, the next several decades, any major aspiring politician has to kind of publicly proclaim their support for the working class and to support this constitution that protects the working class. And that's just an expectation that people will put on Mexican government leaders for decades after 1917. But still, the Zapata and Pancho Villa movements are still active. They're largely not big enough to threaten the central government or to really threaten the nation's stability in much ways. I mean, these were very much smaller movements by this point. But they were still somewhat threatening, especially to Carranza, who was, extensively worried about these types of groups. So Carranza's government will start to figure out how to end these revolts one way or the other. And one way that they hit on is to just flat out ambush and murder Zapata in April 1919. Carranza at this point kind of goes back on his word and moves to break a railroad strike in the northern areas of the country, which caused a lot of Mexican workers to feel very much betrayed. Carranza has made a lot of promises since 1914, And now to them it appears that he's going back on his promises by breaking a labor union strike. And as 1920 gets close, which is the next election year, he tried to basically appoint one of his politicians that he's a personal friend with to be his successor to the presidency in 1920. So Carranza is basically pointing at this new person and saying, everybody vote for him because he'll be, much like me, he'll be good for the country. But that really offended a whole lot of Mexican citizens, because we have to remember that in the debates going into the election of 1910, 10 years earlier, that the popular complaint was that President Diaz had run for re-election so many times. So they look at Carranza's attempt to handpick his presidential successor as basically the same thing that Diaz had been doing. So they start to say, well, we had all these revolts and all these battles and whatnot, and all these people died just to give Carranza the same power that Diaz had. And they really say, no way, they're sick of this kind of thing. And they start a rallying cry of basically what they call no re-election, which means that Carranza is basically trying to re-elect himself by kind of choosing the next president personally. And at this point, going into 1920, things start getting kind of confusing. Alvaro Obregón comes out of political retirement at this point and seems to have got a lot of loyalty from the Mexican military troops, and that he personally had Carranza arrested and assassinated in May 1920. So there's a lot of rumors about a secret deal between Obregón and the soldiers who actually killed Carranza. So in 1920, this is still a presidential election year, Obregón has gotten rid of Carranza, and Obregón's bigger goal is really to try to control Mexican politics from the shadows. So Obregón does not run himself for president in 1920. But he's kind of in the background pulling the strings and trying to control the Mexican government, even though he's not officially in office. So with Carranza assassinated and out of office, for the short term, the presidency fell to one of Carranza's vice presidents. And Obregón allowed that to happen because, again, he felt that this new president would be easy to control. And Obregón largely seems to have controlled the political party and the president that took over for Carranza. And then Obregón decides to run for the presidency himself in the elections of 1920 and actually won in November 1920. So he will become the next president of Mexico to start the next kind of what some historians call the post-revolutionary era of Mexico. So what does Obregón want to accomplish? First thing is to calm down all these revolts. And Zapata is dead by this point, so Pancho Villa is the big kind of person that he wants to basically get rid of politically one way or the other. So Obregón offered a deal to Pancho Villa that Villa would get a pardon for the crimes that he had committed, and that he would receive a ranch, some land where he can go live, and he can hire workers to make some money off of. So he'll have a fairly comfortable retirement. But the point is that he needs to retire. So Obregón basically buys him out and pushes him into political retirement. And Villa takes the deal. And Pancho Villa seems to have abided by that deal. He basically followed that deal until he was ambushed and assassinated in 1923. So his retirement didn't last very long. So most historians argue that Obregon's election in 1920 largely ended the kind of pitched battlefield battles between different groups of Mexicans fighting it out to see who's going to stay on top and actually run the government. So those large-scale pitched battles basically end with Obregon's election in 1920. But political violence still continued. So other historians argue that the revolution is still ongoing into the 1920s because there's assassinations, there's attempts at intimidating the high government leaders, and all that stuff continues into the 1930s. But we're still in the early 1920s, so what does President Obregon try to do? What does he accomplish? One of the big ones is to allow U.S. oil companies to drill for oil in Mexico. So Obregon offered that opportunity to the United States and its companies and promised to never nationalize or confiscate private land or resources that the oil companies might own. And in exchange for this nice deal, Obregon asked for formal U.S. recognition of the Mexican government under him, which the United States does in 1923. But Obregon's not done there. He also wants to build up a rural education system, so basically free government schools. He starts scaling that system up as quickly as possible. He starts making deals with worker unions. With the exception of any unions that seem to have been led by communists or anarchists. Obregon hated both of those different ideologies, and often attacked workers who said such things or leveled such criticisms against their employers or the whole social system or the government in general. Some historians argue that Obregon's biggest accomplishment in office is actually just to hold an election, and when that next person is elected, who happens to be this guy named Calles, that Obregon's biggest contribution to Mexican politics is to simply accept the election of somebody else and peacefully transfer power to that new administration. So Calles takes the presidency and enters office in the last month of 1924, and that's when Obregon leaves. And we should remember that this is the first time that there's been a peaceful, legitimate transfer of power according to the voters' will since the 1870s. So there's a lot of excitement in Mexico for the future regarding democracy. Plutarco Calles was basically a general from one of the northern states in Sonora. He didn't have a whole lot of political opponents. His biggest opponents were actually a very conservative religious group called the Cristeros, basically the people who call themselves Christers, or the followers of Christ. And they largely don't like Calles, not so much personally, but they hate generally what the Mexican Revolution has become, which they see as basically anti-clerical, anti-church, anti-Catholicism, and possibly even motivated and controlled by Satan in order to destroy church-based groups in Mexico. So accusations are getting pretty extreme by that point. So after 4 years of this, Obregon decides that he wants to run for another term as president in 1928, and he actually won that election in 1928. Some other revolts had broken out in 1928, but his win as president of the country seems to have slowed down, in some instances even stopped or suppressed those revolutionary movements. The problem for Obregon, though, is that the Catholic Church and a lot of Catholic followers are very angry at the government having taken what is often defined as like an anti-religious stance. So a Catholic follower actually assassinated Obregon before he could be inaugurated for having won the 1928 election. Why did a Catholic do this? That person basically blamed Obregon for persecuting Catholics in Mexico, which is a pretty extreme accusation that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of evidence behind it. So now President Calles is still in office because the new president who had just been elected in 1928 didn't even make it to the inauguration. So Calles basically says that there needs to be a new election. So Calles calls for new elections in 1928 to be held as soon as possible to choose another leader, and he also builds a new political party called the Partido Nacional Revolucionario. So basically the National Revolutionary Party. And his leadership of that new party keeps him kind of behind the scenes and trying to be a major political kind of power. He wants to stay in the sidelines. He's not going to be president anymore, but he wants to stay in the sidelines and try to control the political scene from the shadows, basically, in secret. So that's Calles' kind of strategy for the long term. Keep power without actually being in office. And then a very surprising thing happened in the 1934 elections. A total outsider that was pretty much unknown throughout the entire country, named Lázaro Cárdenas, won the presidency in that election. So that was very shocking to much of the country. And most political observers accepted Cárdenas to make some kind of political deal with Calles. And most observers thought that Calles was the more savvy politician, and that Calles would be able to control President Lázaro and basically still try to run the government from the background. But Lázaro Cárdenas wasn't really putting up with that. Right when he was inaugurated, he sent Calles into exile, so kicked him out of the country, which was extremely shocking throughout the entire country and throughout the whole region. And Cárdenas will run Mexico as president for the next several years and becomes one of the more powerful and famous presidents in Mexico's history. So Cárdenas will basically institutionalize the big changes that the revolution had brought to Mexico that were largely written into the 1917 Constitution. And because the level of political violence and assassinations really go down quite dramatically under this new president, most historians define, or at least many historians, define the Cárdenas presidency as the real end point of the Mexican Revolution and the start of a new kind of constitutional and very stable era. So we'll talk in future lectures about that stability and how it was achieved and what the National Revolutionary Party becomes and how it evolves throughout the rest of the 1900s. So we'll stop here and we'll get into talking about some other countries and their experience in this same era going up to World War II.